am not a clever man. Apparently everyone knew that the blizzard was coming. Everyone except me, that is. And not only did I decide to continue with my journey that night in my ramshackle old heap of a car, I also didn't tell anyone else where I was going, or even make sure my phone was fully charged. Yeah, I'm an idiot. But that still doesn't make what happened any easier to deal with. So of course, as I was driving along, the car broke down in the middle of nowhere, just as the blizzard was really beginning to bite, leaving me stranded on a little country road that I'd never been on before, with no way of getting help and no sign of passing cars to come to my aid. Everyone else was too sensible to be out on a night like that. A night so bleak and wild, and only 2 days before Christmas. I sat there for a while, cocooned in the relative warmth of my useless vehicle while the snow whirled around outside. There had already been a few significant falls over the last couple of days, but this blizzard was on another level entirely. Although the night was relatively still, the sheer volume of snow that was falling meant that the road would soon be impassable, and that if I wasn't careful, I could pretty soon be in real trouble. Even in the short time I had sat there, the snow had started to settle on the windscreen of the car, blocking out the snowbound scene beyond. The car's heater was already starting to struggle, and the longer I waited, the harder it would be to trek through the snow and find some kind of shelter. I put on my gloves, zipped up my coat, and stole myself to venture out into the freezing night. Thankfully, the situation wasn't as bad as it could have been. I remembered passing a small cottage just before the car had given up on me. It couldn't have been more than half a mile away, which would be difficult, but doable. The going was hard from the onset, with the snow already thick on the road. Within a minute or two, I was all but smothered by the swiftly falling flakes, which clung to me with a clammy obstinacy that no amount of brushing could free me from. By the time I could see a hazy light shining through the swarming snowflakes, I was soaked to the bone and thoroughly exhausted. My feet were like blocks of ice, and my face was numb and frozen, but the warm orange glow of the light spurred me on, giving me the boost I needed to soldier on just a little bit longer. When I finally arrived at the front gate, I could have wept with relief. The cottage was picture postcard perfect, a little bastion of comfort and warmth, huddled against the glowering darkness and vicious, penetrating cold of the blizzard. Lights blazed happily from its windows, and 2 snowmen even stood as silent sentinels over the barely visible garden path. But something wasn't quite right. When I got to the front door, it was already open, and little flurries of snow spilled into the otherwise warm and inviting hallway. I stepped in and slammed it shut behind me. An eerie silence suddenly engulfed me, and at that moment, I felt like an intruder, awkward and out of place. Hello? My voice sounded flat and lifeless in the cramped little hall. Is there anybody there? No answer came. I walked through each room of the cottage in turn, knocking gingerly on each one before poking my head in. The place was utterly deserted. It seemed as though whoever lived there had just stepped out for a moment. A fire blazed in the grate, and the dishes from the evening meal were neatly stacked in a pile by the sink. There was even a Christmas tree, with an assortment of presents tucked underneath it in the living room, but there was no sign of any living soul in the place. I sat down on the very edge of the couch, almost afraid to touch anything. A log popped in the fire, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I took a deep breath, and chuckled slightly at my own nervousness. Okay, it was a strange situation, but I was out of the cold, I had a roof over my head, and I wasn't likely to lose any toes to frostbite anytime soon. All I had to do was wait. The family would return eventually, the blizzard would die down, and soon everything would be right with the world again. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The only thing that kept me company was the steady ticking of an old grandfather clock out in the hall. After perhaps an hour of waiting, I couldn't stand it any longer. I needed to do something, even if only to distract myself from the laborious passing of time. I made a quick check of the house for a phone, but there was nothing. Still, that wasn't so odd. Lots of people don't have a landline now since mobile phones are everywhere. I found a pen and a scrap of paper in the kitchen and wrote a quick note explaining the situation, which I then pinned to the front door. I thought it best to give the family as much warning as possible on their return home before they found a strange man in their home. Peering out the window, the snow was still falling with the same languid, heavy insistence as before. The 2 snowmen, lumpen and misshapen under the fresh weight of snow, seemed to be craning forward and staring back in at me. I shuddered and pulled the curtains closed. It felt like I was taking advantage of the kindness of strangers as I walked through their house. There was a photograph on the mantel above the fire. 2 little kids, a boy and a girl, maybe 7 and 8, and their father, an unsmiling, severe man who looked as though he'd seen more than his share of harsh times. No mother, But that wasn't particularly peculiar in this day and age. I told myself I was looking for some kind of clue as to their whereabouts as I crept through the cottage, but in reality, I think I was just being a little nosy and wanted to peek into the lives of my unwitting hosts. The cottage itself was pristine. It looked like it must have been cleaned on a daily basis, and even the room that the kids shared was remarkably neat. In fact, the only thing out of place in the whole house was a smashed plate, which I found in the corner of the kitchen, which I swept up and put in the garbage. It only took 2 minutes, and it was the least I could do considering the hospitality I'd already helped myself to. I went back and sat on the couch again, after turning on their ancient TV set, only to find that it didn't work. It was now well past midnight, and there was no sign of the father and his 2 kids. I felt like little Goldilocks as I lay down on the couch, spread my coat over myself, and settled my weary body down to sleep. I jolted awake hours later after an unsettled night. A clock radio had kicked on, sending the velvet tones of Bing Crosby's White Christmas echoing eerily through the otherwise silent house. I felt stiff and unrested, almost as if I hadn't slept at all that night. The house was still empty. I checked the front door, and my note was still in place. Opening the curtains, I saw that the snow was no longer falling, but it covered everything in drifts that looked at least a couple of feet deep. I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. I spent the rest of the day in limbo, wandering idly from room to room, resisting the temptation to rummage through my host's possessions to try to find out more about them. It was odd. Usually you can tell a lot about a family from a quick stroll through their house, but this little cottage was like a blank slate. It was all antiseptic surfaces and neatly folded bedcloths. There weren't even any kids' drawings stuck to the fridge. It was a completely neutral space, devoid of any personality whatsoever. The broken plate I'd tidied away had been the only human touch to the whole place. The day passed slowly. I ventured outside for a time, tramping through the deep snow in an attempt to get the measure of the place now that it was light. The thick snowdrifts muffled every sound, giving the whole scene a strange sense of serenity. I felt like I was walking around on top of a giant wedding cake. There was a small shed in the corner of the garden. The door was open, but it seemed far from welcoming. Nevertheless, I trudged towards it, eager to see what secrets it might hold. The interior was dirty and dingy, in marked contrast to the immaculate house. There were cobwebs everywhere, and the tools that hung from the walls were old and rusted, except there was a single blank space on the tool board, a space with no dust or dirt or mess surrounding it, where some well-used tool had already been taken. The cold drove me back indoors again, and I soon got the fire started from last night's embers. And amongst the loose papers provided for kindling, I found a sheaf of what looked like crude children's drawings. Once the fire was lit, I settled back down on the couch to examine them. One drawing in particular caught my eye. It featured a clumsy, yet still recognizable rendition of the cottage, with 3 figures standing beside it. 2 of them seemed to be standing with their hands on their hips, with large, unhappy frowns on their faces, and bright blue tears streaming from their eyes, while the third, drawn much bigger, had furious red eyes and appeared to be holding what looked like a snake. Something about the drawing intrigued me, although I couldn't put my finger on it. The rest of the pictures had a childhood innocence about them, but this one disturbed me. I spent the rest of the day leafing through some old paperback westerns I found in the main bedroom, but none of them were interesting enough to really hold my attention. My mind kept returning to this strange little family and the odd, isolated life they must lead out here. Maybe it was normal for them to disappear for days at a time. Maybe they had traveled somewhere for Christmas. Time dragged. I made another circuit of the house, just for something to do, and stoked up the fire in the evening, ready for another night on the couch. I fell asleep instantly out of pure exhaustion. I rose early, peering through the window to find that a thaw had set in overnight. The blanket of snow had retreated somewhat, and the bright sun edging over the horizon held the promise of further melting. Trekking back to the village would be tough, but it was certainly doable and wouldn't take more than a couple of hours. Besides, I felt like I'd overstayed my welcome as it was, and it would be a good idea to get out of the house. I wrote a short note explaining the situation and left it on the kitchen table, along with a little money. "Think of it as a Christmas present," I wrote, and headed out the door. I cut straight across the garden between the 2 snowmen towards the gate. The thawing snow now had a crust of ice on top, which made a satisfying crunch with every step I took. I hadn't gone far when my foot caught on something under the snow, almost sending me flying. Looking down, I saw a gnarled human hand, poking up from the surrounding sea of white. Instantly, I dropped to my knees in the wet snow and began to dig, raking back armfuls of ice and quickly uncovering the body underneath. I knew who it was immediately, the father of the family, his face oddly serene in death, with an ugly, bloody dent on the side of his head. He must have slipped in the snow and knocked himself out. A large stone laid under his head like a pillow, and the cold had done the rest. I stood for a moment over the corpse, taking in the scene in all its eerie stillness, with the squat little cottage looking on. It was then that I looked at the dead man's other hand, and saw what he was clutching in his stiff, white fingers. A coiled bullwhip, old and obviously well used. The child's drawing I found leapt into my mind, and shock stole the breath from my body. I turned to the two snowmen, which were now little more than shapeless pillars of white. I bounded towards the nearest, and pushed at it with desperate hands, hoping to find solid, hard-packed ice beneath my fingers. But I knew I wouldn't. The snow was light and fluffy, disintegrating even as I touched it. In a matter of moments, I had demolished the towering lump of snow to reveal what my heart already knew would be there. Another body, this time that of a young girl, with her arms tied behind her back and securely fastened to a stout wooden fence post. I dropped to my knees, tears pricking my eyes. I couldn't begin to imagine what they must have suffered. Maybe they'd been relieved at first when their father had fallen, thinking that they had delayed or even escaped their punishment, with their relief turning to a panic as they slowly realized their father wasn't getting up again. It was all so senseless, so pointlessly tragic. In the days since then, the children have continued to haunt me. I wonder if there was anything I could have done, if the two of them were perhaps still alive in their icy tombs when I was walking through their cozy and welcoming home, utterly oblivious to their existence. I think a part of me will forever remain there, in that little wintry garden, staring at the two lifeless bodies. I recently became homeless. One small unfortunate event happened after the other, until I found myself living on the streets of Colorado. I'm a 26-year-old male. I come from a middle-class family, where I grew up in Georgia. I had a rough upbringing with an abusive father, who kicked me out of the house the day I turned 18. This sent me down an unexpected path, not knowing what to do or where to go. I eventually found myself in Colorado, where I worked as a janitor just 5 minutes away from my apartment. After breaking my leg, I begged my boss to let me keep the job for the time being. Retrospectively, I should have handled it better, but I let my emotions get the best of me, and I was essentially fired. This was a huge problem for me, since I didn't have a car, and relied on walking to get to work in addition to shopping. I knew I was screwed as I stood in front of a payphone, using the last quarters I owned to make the dreaded call to my parents to ask them to let me move back. At first, my dad was completely against it, but after my mom pleaded with my dad, he eventually caved in and gave me permission to stay with them for 1 month. This meant that I would need to find a job, so I took no time to hesitate to start making the journey back home. In my desperate situation, I booked a flight home with my remaining money from my sold belongings. Once my flight landed, my mom met me at the airport around 8:30 p.m. The drive from the airport to my parents' house was typically about 30 minutes, but my mom drove slow on the way back. Although it didn't seem like much to me, there were about 2 inches of snow on the ground, which was not as common in Georgia as it was in Colorado. It was snowing pretty hard, so the visibility was poor. We eventually got off the freeway, where the rest of the journey home would be taken through side streets. My mom continued driving as we turned down a desolate road with woods encompassing both sides. The road was very hilly, but I was familiar with it, as I used to go hiking in the area with my friends when I was a kid. We gradually climbed up the ascending road until it dropped very steeply into a valley-like portion, where the road would steeply incline shortly after. However, the roads were very slick, given that they were unplowed and not salted. My mom questioned whether we should turn back or not, but I foolishly convinced her to keep going. That was a big mistake. On the way up the steep hill, the wheels to her car began spinning until the car reversed into an uncontrollable descent. The situation was far from ideal, given that we were now stuck in between two steep hills. There was no chance that my mom's two-wheel drive sedan would make it out without help. She called my dad several times, but he didn't pick up. Since I was still on crutches, we exhausted our next option by having my mom push the car from behind in an attempt to climb up the hill. This obviously didn't work, and we quickly gave up. As my mom began looking for a tow truck on her phone, 2 headlights emerged from the top of the hill from the way we had just come. To avoid ending up in the same situation as us, My mom tried to wave her hands to get them to stop before they went down the hill. Despite her efforts, coupled with the poor visibility from the blizzard, the headlights only grew closer as the car descended down the hill. As it approached, it became more and more obvious that it was a truck. I'm not sure what the make or model was, but it looked big and most likely had four-wheel drive. My mom waved them down in an attempt to ask for help. The truck slowly rolled up beside my mom, and I watched from inside the car as they conversed. Shortly after the encounter, my mom turned back towards the car and opened the door. She quickly got in, and I instantly recognized the panic in her voice. She told me that there were two guys inside that creeped her out, and didn't give any attention to her request for help, but rather made inappropriate comments to her. I shuddered in disgust, as I waited for the truck to eventually pass. However, they didn't go around us, they stayed parked. After a minute, the doors on each side of the truck swung open and the two guys emerged. They began walking to each side of our car. As they neared, I could see that the one guy looked to be in his mid-30s and had a long, scraggly beard. I tensed up as I cracked the window to speak with the guy on my side of the car. "Looks like you broke your leg, huh?" I nodded my head in response, and the two guys started laughing. I quickly felt the danger of the situation intensify, realizing we were essentially trapped. Almost simultaneously, they both walked back to the truck and got in. I looked at my mom, who was just as worried as I was. Seconds later, they got back out. They both walked up to the driver's side door. With my mom's window still cracked open, the one guy leaned in towards the car. He said, "Ma'am, please step out of the car," almost as if he was pretending to be a police officer. She said no, and that's when the terror of the situation really escalated. Although it was not visible before, the man behind pulled out a hammer out of his waistband and struck the window. My mom and I screamed as the glass shattered all over the inside of the car. They both proceeded to reach in and grab my mom, but despite her best efforts, she was unable to stop them. I sat there, useless and defenseless, as I watched my mom being carried away to the truck, kicking and screaming. I weighed out my options, which at the time, there only seemed to be two. I could try to get out and limp my way over to the truck, or call the police. The second option seemed to be the best, so I quickly dialed 911. As I was on the phone with the operator, I tried to explain the situation, but my sheer panic and shock made it almost impossible to do so. Suddenly, just over the top of the hill, I was able to see the headlights of a car coming towards us. I instantly stepped out, grabbed my crutches, and began waving it to the approaching car. My mom was putting up a great fight, and had still managed to prevent them from putting her in the truck. The car got closer until the two men recognized it as well. They threw her on the ground and quickly sped off, leaving the both of us behind. The car finally reached us. It was a couple. They looked like they were about high school age. They stayed with us until the police showed up, where we then explained the terrifying events that happened moments before their arrival. Unfortunately, none of us were able to get the license plate of the truck or any sound description of the two men. I really consider that couple in the car to be our guardian angels, because the end result would have played out much differently. It just kills me knowing that those two men are out there somewhere, probably attempting the same malicious stunt on other helpless individuals. I live in North Wales, UK. For anyone who has had the pleasure of visiting, it truly is a beautiful place. Though, for an adolescent boy, it is certainly lacking in things to do. As a result, my friends and I would often find ourselves mindlessly exploring areas of countryside and coastline. Despite it being quite sparsely populated, in comparison to the closest cities, there is a dual carriageway running right along the coast from Wales into England. Also, train tracks run alongside this road for most of its course, occasionally passing overhead via a small cement bridge. Anyway, there was one winter night a few years ago, when we got an extremely rare snowstorm. The four of us decided to try and explore the inside of one of these bridges, as one of the group had observed a manhole cover nearby which we believed to be the entrance. On closer inspection, we discovered that several tools would be required in order to gain entry. We returned with the necessary equipment and proceeded to unbolt the cover. This had to be done stealthily, as the train track was right beside us. Not close enough to be of any danger, but definitely a sufficiently small distance to cause panic for any train driver. And panic usually means police. It wasn't too long before we had removed the heavy steel disc and had started descending the ladder down into the structure. Once we had all safely reached the bottom, we decided to progress to the other side. At this point, we were totally confined into the narrow space that leads into the main area. If you are confused as to what this bridge is supposed to be, you probably should be, because it was rather peculiar. I mean, I would have never known that there was even an inside had we not found the hole. So as we crouched and squeezed our way in, scraping along our bellies, we felt a growing sense of claustrophobia between us. The distance from one end to the other is surprisingly long, but by the halfway point, you can look down through the narrow gaps onto the motorway below. This was actually pretty cool, which helped us keep calm in a strange way. At this point, apart from the mild discomfort and confinement, we were still just a group of guys on a wintry adventure. This was about to change dramatically. No more than a few meters beyond halfway, which we could tell due to the symmetry of the passageways through the bridge, one of us claimed they could see some object in the distance at the far end. Hesitantly, we agreed to investigate. I reached the end first, and let me tell you, I have never felt the same sense of dread before or since. In front of me was a single fold-away chair positioned facing a wall. On the wall was a partially torn page from a newspaper that had the names, addresses, and pictures of random people. Several of the pictures had a red X marked across their faces. More disturbingly, the eyes of a woman had been cut from the page. It was removed with precision, not just hastily ripped off. The scene that lay before us had rendered us completely speechless. Suddenly, somewhere along a corridor to the right of the wall, were the sounds of echoing footsteps that seemed to grow nearer with each step. An overpowering sense of panic could be felt collectively. Needless to say, we got out of there as fast as humanly possible, smashing our knees and shins against the sharp cement edges. Of course, we were all praying to God that the hole hadn't been resealed, as it was impossible to tell until you reached the ladder itself. Thankfully, the exit was clear and we promptly dashed straight home.